Today's 10-Minute Teacher Podcast is sponsored by SmartBrief. Stay tuned at the end of the show to learn how SmartBrief can make reading the news fast and easy, even during the school day. How to Talk to Kids About Poverty, episode 494.
The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today.
Today, we're talking with Jaime Casap. He is Chief Education Evangelist at Google. But Jaime, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about your story because you have worked on a book called On Our Street, Our First Talk About Poverty. And you have a little bit of a story that you think can help us to talk with kids about this topic. So tell us a little bit of your story.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here. But I think a lot of my passion for education comes from my personal story. I'm a first-generation American. I was born and raised in Hell's Kitchen, New York back in the 60s and 70s and 80s when it wasn't a great place to be, not like it is today. And I was raised by a single mother, and I was raised on welfare and food stamps, in a violent community. That's how I grew up. And I wouldn't be here talking to you unless it was for my education, right? So I graduated high school, went to college, went to graduate school, been at Google for 13 years, Accenture for 7 years, and I owe all that to my education process. But one of the things that I learned in those 25 years after doing all that is that even until just a couple of years ago, I would hide who I was and where I came from. I wouldn't talk about growing up poor because I think there's a subconscious thing that happens where those of us who grow up poor, those of us who are in those types of environments, we feel like other people judge us based on that poverty, right? Even though as a kid, you have no control over it, right? So if you're poor, you're lazy. If you're poor, you're not working hard enough. And so I wanted to break that stigma in two ways. Number one is when I talk to students, and especially students who are growing up the way I grew up, I tell them to own who they are and where they come from and that it's competitive advantage for them because their experiences and what they've gone through and what they've seen can help them in no matter what they do in life. And so it's a competitive advantage to own who they are and where they come from. At the same time, we have to kill the stigma of poverty. And one of the issues that we've never really talked about is how do you talk to your students about poverty? How do you talk to your kids about poverty? And, you're walking down a city street with your kid and they see someone homeless on the side. If that kid asks you, why is that person homeless? What do you say? What's your answer? So I partnered with a child psychologist who is a lot smarter than I am and took my personal story and what she knows about child psychology and created this book about how to talk to kids about poverty and what it means and where it comes from and what are some of the issues behind it. And the book's does really well. And it's actually been used in different elementary schools, both in Canada and the United States, about how do we talk to students about poverty. So I'm trying to do both at the same time and same time launching a bunch of different initiatives, including my YouTube channel to reach kids who are growing up a lot like I grew up.
So your YouTube channel that we'll link to in the show notes is for kids?
Well, it's for students. It's rated PG. It's for high school students. It's for college students. It's for people who are starting out in their career. So there's two angles to it. It's this idea that I want to be able to share my advice and the lessons that I've learned, not just working at Google, but the 25 years I've been working, but also from that perspective of a kid who's growing up like I did. And so one of the videos, for example, is this video that I'd love teachers to share with students, which is, if I can do this, you can do this, right? There's nothing special about me. I just had some luck. So if I can accomplish these things through education, you can accomplish these things. And all the lessons that I've learned through life is what I'm trying to share through those videos that I started putting out there.
Well, but certainly, I know you say all you have is just luck, but certainly you've had some difficult times and some decisions in there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the conversation as well. I mean, even past graduating from graduate school, there was a time when I had to make a decision about whether I was going to pursue one job and stick to something that I wasn't passionate about, something that I did not want to do, or get in my 1984 beat up Celebrity and drive across the country with no savings account, no money, no nothing to look for a job that I wanted to do, right? And so that's one of the stories that I share in one of my videos. So it's this idea about the decisions that you made and being true to who you are. And then the quote that I get credited with all the time is this idea that we have to stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up and instead ask them what problem they want to solve. What problem do you want to solve and how do you want to solve it? And what do you need to learn to solve that problem? That's the point, is that we have a generation of students, especially first generation students, especially kids that are growing up in poverty, who I'm trying to help look at the world from a different perspective.
And how can you help teachers? Because I'll tell you, when I talk to teachers around the world, I'm sure as you do, they'll say, oh, what you're doing is great, but, and then I know what I'm going to hear. And it's usually going to be, but I work in a high poverty area and we can't. So what's your message to teachers? Because certainly somebody in your life helped you and you can.
When I talk to teachers, I think it's the hardest thing that I do. It's the thing that gives me the most reward. But when I talk to teachers, I tell them that the impact that they have on students is something that goes on for generations and generations and generations. Whether you teach for 2 years or 40 years, you're going to have an impact on kids that you will never meet in your whole life. Because I have my kids now, and they're doing fine, and their kids are going to be doing fine. And that's because of my 4th grade teacher, or my 6th grade teacher, or my 9th grade teacher. That's why I have so much passion for educators and for education as something that disrupts poverty, as something that changes families' destinies. And we should be taking as much advantage of that as we possibly can.
And I'll link in the show notes to my first podcast episode, which is about my mom and a teacher. My mom grew up in poverty, and I'm here literally because of a conversation she had with a teacher that changed the course of her life. So, Jaime, let me ask you this. What do people say about poverty that makes you angry and you think that the people shouldn't say this or they shouldn't think this way? And how should they think?
Yeah, I think the big stereotype when it comes to poverty is that someone chooses to be poor, right? Like, oh, all you have to do is work harder. I don't understand why you don't get your education. I don't understand why you don't do well in school, right? When we think about the kids that are in our classrooms, we want equality across the board. And absolutely every kid should have access to the same education, the same resources. But what we also need to focus on is equity and understand that not every kid in that classroom has the same background, has the same experiences. So you might have a kid or 2 or 3 in your classroom that actually might even need post-traumatic stress syndrome training because they just witnessed something terrible the night before, but they don't talk about it, right? So this idea that poverty is a choice is, I think, what frustrates me more than anything. That question that you get from employers all the time, like, what do you want to be doing in 5 years? My answer in my head has been the same. Still today, if someone asks me, what do you want to be doing in 5 years? My answer is not poor. Nobody wants to be poor, right? And so I think if we all start with that idea, which is, wait, no one that we see that's poor, that living in poverty wants to be there. So what can we do from an equity perspective to help to provide the resources that they need to lift them out of that poverty?
So early in our conversation, you said for students from a background of poverty to realize that their background can help them. It can be a competitive advantage. How is your background been a competitive advantage for you as Chief Education Evangelist at Google?
That, more than anything, is what the message I try to get to students, because you're going to have a unique point of view, right? If every single kid graduates from the same kind of school and then they live in the same kind of environment and then they go to the same kind of college and they go on the same trip to Europe and, they do all that, then you're going to have 100 people with the same perspective. But because you're growing up the way you grow up and because you have a unique perspective and a unique point of view and something that other people might not have experienced or seen, that gives you perspective. But you have to own it. You have to say, what is my background? What does my experience give me in terms of perspective in this specific situation? And that's true in education, in the business world, in the nonprofit world. You have a unique empathy almost, especially if you're working to support generations of students and people who are growing up the way you did.
Jaime, could you give a 30-second pep talk to teachers who are working with kids in a high poverty classroom?
Yeah, I think that the best thing about students in general is their passion when you can figure out what they're passionate about, right? Oftentimes, even when I work with students in 10th grade, I'll ask them, what are you passionate about? They'll say nothing. I'm not passionate about anything. And you have to dig deeper, and you'll find kids eventually will say things like, I want to stop poverty in my community. I want to stop drug abuse in my community. I want to create better housing in my community. The passion, the advocacy you can create from that negative experience is tremendous if we can figure out a way to turn that on.
And Jamie, that's what good teachers do. Good teachers dig until they find those passions. And I'll have students, I'll ask the same question. I'll say, be curious, have an opinion. You're not here just to convert air. You're here for a purpose. You have something to do. So let's find that passion. So the book is on our street, our first talk about poverty. And thank you, Jamie. We will link to your YouTube channel with some resources for teachers and their students as well. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
The evolving world of EdTech can often seem overly complicated, but it doesn't have to be. SmartBrief on EdTech is a daily email news service made specifically for educators like us. It condenses the latest industry news into a quick 2-minute digest. The folks at SmartBrief read everything, and we get what matters. So activate your free subscription today by heading to coolcatteacher.com/SmartBrief. So that is coolcatteacher.com/SmartBrief. Thanks for staying smart with SmartBrief.
Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.